So when I try to think about the time of the story of Hong Kong art from the 1980s to now, and in a very simple way, I like to break it down into three generations. So I would call that the Bohemian generation, and that's up to about 1995. And then I would call the next one the ADC generation. That's when actually government or taxpayers' money starts to become available for the arts, which was such a novelty. Up until that time, you want to do something, fine, you do it, but it's up to you. You have to pay for it. Nobody's going to come and watch it. There's no way you can go and present it anyway. But after 1995, one of the institutions that came into existence was Parasite, actually. That started exactly in that ADC money moment and many other art spaces in Hong Kong. So it's only then you really have the beginning of an infrastructure that actually sort of has stayed around. Things that happened before that time were either temporary events or else they were intended as long-term, but they never were because people ran out of money to pay for it in their own pockets. I'm thinking of, for example, there was an artist space called Quart.
Yes.
And that was really very interesting, but it died very soon,
It's also very vibrant when they invested.
But that's almost like another story. And then the third generation would be, the last few years would be the art market generation, after Art Basel and all this sort of thing, all these big galleries coming to Hong Kong, and a commercial art infrastructure suddenly being incredibly big, and that's, to me, the least interesting in a way. That's a kind of time of normalization of the Hong Kong art world. So the most interesting phases are the first two, and the most interesting to me personally is the very first of what I'm calling the Bohemian one, and that's the one where Antonio Mak belonged, and in fact he didn't even live to the ADC era, unfortunately. So as I'm saying, most things done in that era are much smaller in scale. The museums didn't care about contemporary art at all. We didn't call it contemporary art, and you just did it because you had to do it. So people did things because they were intensely motivated. Art was something you didn't ask why you would do it. You just did it because you had to do it. Obviously you did it. So it was often quite a private thing in a way, only a small art world compared to today. Any kind of art event, you would know everyone who was there because it was that small. And you mentioned some names already. I think of other names like Wong Yan-kwai, Oscar Ho. Then there were other sort of circles, like the photographers. They were quite strong in their own way, like Wong Wo-bick. The photography circle had its own very specific code. And it's also a sort of generational thing, you can say. This is a generation of Hong Kong people who grew up with Hong Kong as their horizon. And that's how I would distinguish it from the previous generation, who often were the people who came from China or have much more sense of Chinese culture in a broader way. So really hard to see art, and that included Antonio's art. I mean, this is like a big theme that even now it's hard to see his art. And when Valerie did her show is it 2008? Yeah. I mean, the show is about looking for Antonio Mak. Even in 2008, you had to kind of look to try and find where he was, because it's hard to find him. And it's always been that way. So even during his lifetime, you have rare opportunities to see his work in a public place. I remember the major show to me in a public venue was at the Art Centre. That was the only place contemporary art was shown in about 1993. There was a show of Almond Chu and Antonio Mak and Parasite work together, and that was quite an important one to me. And then the only really big showing of his work was, so unfortunately, the one that came after his very early death in 1995. There was a retrospective that really was very, very comprehensive, and that's when this book was produced as the catalogue, and there hasn't really been anything apart from Valerie's show since. So Valerie's show was different because it wasn't trying to showcase just his work, it was trying to look at how his work may relate to the practice of later artists as well, so it had a more complex kind of role. So I felt very close to that generation, that so-called, what I'm calling the Bohemian generation, partly because they all studied overseas, it seemed, partly because where would you be able to study in Hong Kong? You know, a few people could study at CUHK, but then no other real possibilities. And it's only really more recently you have the Hong Kong Art School set up, the Baptist Academy set up, and then as a response to that, CUHK expanding its program and everything like that. So I think that made it an interesting scene because people had studied in Japan, they studied in France, they studied in the US, the UK, in his case in the UK at Goldsmiths, and then did his MA at the Slade School. And so it actually you had people with very different trainings coming back and starting a conversation together. And because I just arrived in 1986, I arrived from somewhere else. Of course, the difference was they were all from Hong Kong originally, but actually their trajectory is a little bit similar to mine, in that they're arriving back in the 1980s or sometimes the 1970s and trying to work out how you could make a foreign training make sense of art practice in Hong Kong. And so their problem and my problem was a similar problem. You know, certainly it took me a few years before I could find a way to connect to the space and understand what was going on here. But I felt the same was true of those artists of my generation then. You know, it took them a while to work out. Actually, going overseas to study is the easy part, you know. Like Xu Beihong or Ding Feng Mian or whatever, they went overseas to study, and you just sit in your class in Paris and you do what everyone else is doing, and you know there's a proper structure of what you have to learn. Fine, and maybe you do really well. Maybe you get a work in exhibitions in the salon or something like that. Fine, but then when you come back home to China or Hong Kong, nobody's telling you, nothing in your training tells you what that training, how that training should be applied in this cultural situation. Your teachers knew nothing about it. They weren't thinking about that at all. So, you know, what does a French art training mean for a Chinese artist returning to China in the 1920s, or a Hong Kong artist returning to Hong Kong in the 1980s? It's completely down to you to work up what that meant. And it was an interesting debate, I think. And it took a while for people to work out how they're going to localize their practice. And in a way, to begin with, they weren't even really always localizing it. They just, of course, you naturally start off by just carrying on doing what you were doing already. Maybe it was quite interesting anyway. And sometimes I got the feeling that there were artists who were almost making art for an international audience that didn't even know that they exist. It's like as if they were waiting for some famous curator like Leo Costelli to knock on their studio door, which wasn't going to happen, you know. But the key time was when people forgot all that and they started to do something that was much more locally orientated. And then things started to make sense. Making art for a local audience, paradoxically, meant that they were making art that people obviously could be interested in too, you know. So that was the key thing. And I think you can put it down to one day in history where that transformation really started to happen. And of course that day is the 4th of June 1989. You know, that was an event in Beijing or in China, but it really started a sense of localism in Hong Kong, because in combination with the countdown towards the handover, people started to think about, well, maybe, you know, we're not going to have some smooth convergence with a modernizing China after all. It's going to be more complicated than that, and we've got to think about our own future with a transition happening that we don't really have much say over. So I think that's what really galvanized the art, and I see that there with Antonio's work too, that although a lot of the themes of his art are there, if you go through year by year, a lot of he's very consistent in the kind of themes that interest him. The themes and the elements. By themes, I would mean things like binary oppositions. That's a kind of theme in a lot of his art. And language is something he liked to play with, or 2D, 3D is a kind of theme that he wants to play with a lot. Like he often uses mirrors in his sculptures to introduce a two-dimensional surface within a three-dimensional work. And the elements that come back are horses, tigers, mirrors, steps, trees, ladders. You've got the ladder. More about that later, probably. Books and the male body. Particularly the male body. Those are themes that come back again and again. So rather than sort of moving from subject to subject, he plays with the same elements. And I like to think of that as thinking with things. Somehow the fact that he's always using the same elements enables him to move forward in his thinking. Like the famous British artist and poet of the Romantic era, William Blake, he says, "The fool who persists in his folly becomes wise." The problem is most of us don't persist, so we don't really learn. But if you really carry on in a single direction, eventually you'll find out what things are. So the fact that he's really staying with similar elements and coming back to them, I think enables him to do what I would want to call thinking with things, trying to use objects to come up with ideas. Often it's the elements of his sculptures are usually fairly small, tabletop type sculptures, so they're manipulable. They're kind of objects you could move around, and somehow that's also tied up with this ability to play with things, think with things. It's a conceptual kind of art that he's involved with, but it's something more than just pure conceptual art as we normally think of it, because for me his art is tied to, on the one hand there's a conceptual side, on the other hand there is very much an interest in the craft of making, the traditional sculptural craft of making. And it's because he's involved in the craft that I think he can think through things. If you're just a conceptual artist, you move from one idea to another idea, but what's the connection? But if you're involved with physical craft and you're playing with materials, then you're thinking with through the materials, and certain things can come from that. I'm not saying that purely conceptual art can't be productive, obviously it can, but a certain kind of productivity is only there if you're involved with actually playing with materials, thinking things through materials themselves. I'm thinking of there's a story about the painter and sculptor Degas. He was friends with the poet Mallarmé, and he used to write poems, and he complained to Mallarmé, "Oh, I have such great ideas for my poems, but then when I finally I finish the poem, it's not so good." And Mallarmé says, "Well, poems aren't made from ideas; they're made from words. And in the same way, maybe art is not made from ideas; it's made from stuff, and that maybe has to apply to conceptual art too." So that's why I think Antonio is interesting. Is partly he's got this conceptual side, but he's also got this physical engagement with material side, and it's a very deep engagement because he casts his own sculpture, which a lot of sculptors don't do. Even very great sculptors don't do. And as regards this sort of turn towards local things, I'm going back to what the point was the bigger point I was trying to make. I think he all the way through he's involved with these same themes and same materials and same subject matter, but after a certain point it starts to get more locally related. He starts to make references to things that are happening in the Hong Kong scene, political events and so forth. And that's all coming in the wake of June 4th at 89. It probably takes a year or two before that works its way through into his art. The first artist that I feel in Hong Kong that really made a kind of breakthrough to local things was Louis Chan. Just to give an example. He's from an earlier generation. I feel these kind of artists who found a way through to something local, it's a very precious thing because it wasn't so easy to do. There was no template for it because Hong Kong, I mean, if Hong Kong was a place that was going to have decolonization, then there's a given template. The template is national narrative and national art, and there's lots of examples you can use to how to do that. But if Hong Kong has this very funny history that doesn't have any kind of template that you can use, you've got to find your own particular way to fabricate a kind of local story. And to me, the first artist who really did this was Louis Chan, and his way of doing it was to go towards the unconscious. He didn't worry about, am I too Chinese or too Western or whatever. He just let his unconscious flow out into his art. So, yeah, just from random mark making, you could say, suddenly finding images and not caring, just let, and what comes out inevitably will have something Hong Kong about it. This one I got this catalogue in Han Art Gallery, and he signed it for me, Louis Chan, and he wrote something on it, and then he started drawing on the images. So this is what he used to do on other people's images. He'd get an art magazine from the US, Art News or Art in America, and he wasn't intimidated by these famous artists. He just started drawing, finding hidden images in their images that made it his images. So that was his sort of way through to something local that moved him beyond being an artist in a kind of minority situation. But I'm mentioning him because I find Antonio's strategy is almost a reverse strategy. His strategy is to become very self-conscious, very ironic about everything. A lot of the artists who were famous in Hong Kong at that time, like Roy Shou-Kwan or Wong, often their art was built around an East meets West kind of structure. There's something very Chinese, but there's something very Western, usually something from abstract expressionism or something like that, and something from ink painting, and you had to carefully sort of juggle or balance these two things together in the same work because you didn't want to seem too westernized because that would be a failure, and you didn't want to seem too Chinese traditional because tradition is so powerful it could swallow you up and then you'd be nothing. So how do you balance the two? And in the balance between that East and the West, often anything to do with Hong Kong got lost. But for Antonio, what he did, instead of getting rid of that East and West thing, I think in a lot of his works he intensified it. So there's more and more of a binary structure in his works. So let me just, I'm talking a bit too long, but let me just look at a couple of examples where I find that the case. Yeah, so this one here is called Bible from Happy Valley. So it shows two of the themes of his art that he liked to come back to. One is horse, and the other is books. And it's a book on the back of a horse. And the horse is bronze, and the book is lead. So the book starts to look a bit like the wings of a winged horse, a mythological horse, a horse that can fly. Bible from Happy Valley, so it's a horse that flies to win a race, maybe, but because its wings are made of lead, it's actually not going to get very far. So it's a sort of paradoxical object. So unlike those earlier generation artists where they're trying to take something binary and make them fit together in a yin-yang way, something Chinese, something Western, neatly going together. Here he's putting two things which really don't go together, and they clash and they work against each other. So on the one thing works against the other. On the one hand it's flight, and the other is the inability to move. Gravity seems to be a big theme that comes through in a number of his works. So I think this is not a work about people who bet on horses or something like that. I think it's some kind of comment on Hong Kong's situation of caught between two things, and one country, two systems, and all this sort of thing. And I think there's also another thing in his work is playing with language, which comes in through the title often, but not always through the title. So I think a book on a horse could be Ma Shang Shu, immediately you lose. A book on a horse, or immediately lose. So it's that kind of. Or in English, you could say, if you want to take a bet, you go to a bookie. A bookie is someone who keeps books on horses. That means he keeps records of all the horses and your bets and so on. So, all this kind of thing sort of comes up, I think. Just give one more example. The Last Tango with Tiger, this one. So this, I think, is really a kind of...
Maybe look a bit higher.
Last Tango with Tiger. This is 1993, I think, is it? Yeah, 1993. So this is really during the run up to the handover. It's really during the period where, once the run up to the handover starts with the joint declaration, but it's only after 89 that starts to become really problematic. And by 1993, you really feel the force of the gravity of 1997 starting to kick in. So I think it's fair to read it as somehow maybe about all these patriotic businessmen who suddenly, instead of getting OBEs, they now suddenly become friends of China, and there's the paradoxical opposites of billionaires who claim to love socialism, communism, because they can see their vested interest there. So opposites dancing together, and how dangerous such a little dance would be. It's not a nice, happy East meets West, Yin meets Yang kind of meeting of opposites. It's a dangerous thing. So he takes something which has been an essentialized notion of China and the West, or opposites, or something like that, and he intensifies it further. So you become very aware of it, and you become aware of it as something that is liable to break down, and is something that you could read onto contemporary situations. So rather than just trying to transcend boundaries, he intensifies boundaries. So maybe that's enough for now. The essay I put in this book, now I've given
that will be published on Parasite's website, so people can read David's essays, including the book. Yes.